Welcome to the Widowed Mom Podcast, episode 227, Why Tough Topics Are Hard to Talk About, an interview with Anna Sale.
Welcome to the Widowed Mom Podcast, the only podcast that offers a proven process to help you work through your grief, to grow, evolve, and create a future you can truly look forward to. Here's your host, Master Certified Life Coach, Grief Expert, Widow, and Mom, Krista St-Germain.
Hey there, welcome to another episode of the podcast. What's going on in your world? How are you doing? Fall is here. You know that means I'm excited. I told you I'd share what I'm getting joy from these days. Something I recently got a lot of joy from and anticipate joy for years to come from was that my daughter decided to go through recruitment as a sophomore and joined Delta Gamma, which is my sorority. I am a proud Delta Gamma alum. I never honestly imagined that I would be in a sorority. I wasn't interested at all when I first was given the opportunity, but later decided to join after having a fairly boring first semester on campus and also getting to know some women and realizing that the stereotypes I had in my mind were not actually what it was like. Turns out that was one of the best decisions I ever made. Delta Gamma gave me, honestly, just such a great experience, such a safe place for me to learn to lead and to communicate and to have hard conversations with people, to learn to be a champion for someone who maybe I didn't see eye to eye with. And of course, if you've listened to the podcast for a while, you probably know, but the whole reason Heather's Camp was started was because my sister, Heather Muller, died and we wanted to do something in her memory. And so we created Heather's Camp, which is a camp for kids who are blind or visually impaired. And we had been doing that camp for about 20 years when the accident happened that killed my husband. So we were coming back from Heather's Camp and that was when the accident happened. So suffice it to say that the women who have experienced the highest of highs in my life and absolutely the lowest of lows, the ones who really rallied around me, were my sisters. They were Delta Gammas. And so that connection means a lot to me. I have been singing Delta Gamma songs to my daughter since she was in the womb. So I realized after watching her go through this process, I didn't think she was interested in it, honestly. And she decided she was, and she kept an open mind and went through it. And wow, I didn't realize how biased I was until I watched her go through that process. It was so hard for me to tell her to follow her heart when I just really wanted to say, join Delta Gamma. Like, there can be no other. But it was really cool to be part of the process and to watch her go through it, to be there. I got to watch the preference night ceremony. As soon as they started singing one of the songs, which I used to sing to her as a baby, she just burst into tears, which made me burst into tears. And it was a whole emotional thing that I just did not anticipate. But then really cool to be there for her bid day and her pinning ceremony and just experience this through her eyes. Again, it's brought back so many amazing memories that I have had, not just of college, but of all the things that I have had the pleasure of experiencing and the person who I have grown into because of my membership. Really, really cool for me. So lots of joy from that. I look forward to watching her go through the new member process and seeing what she contributes to the chapter and what she gets out of it. Just so fun for me. So that's what's bringing me joy these days. And of course, fall. Fall, y'all, always brings me joy. So my favorite season, bar none. All right. Here's what I have for you this week. You may have never heard of Anna Sale, but she is the host of an award-winning podcast called Death, Sex, and Money. And I was lucky enough to interview her on today's episode of the podcast. The reason I wanted to talk with Anna and the reason I think that it's valuable for you is because we are in positions as widows to talk about really hard things all the time, right? And that's what Anna does on her podcast, is she talks about things that are hard for people to talk about. And so I hope you enjoy this conversation and learn a little bit from her on what she has learned from all the interviews that she's done about why things can be so hard to talk about and how to make them easier. So, with that, I will let you listen to my interview with the amazing Anna Sale. All right. Welcome, Anna, to the podcast. I'm delighted that I have found another human who wants to come and talk about hard things. So, thank you for being here.
Thank you very much for having me.
Yeah. Why don't you just start and just tell our listeners a little bit about you, what you do, who you are?
Yeah, I am an interviewer. I work in public radio, and for almost 10 years now, I've hosted a show called Death, Sex, and Money, um, which when we started it in 2014, the intention was pretty simple, which was let's create a space where we're going to talk about these things that can be hard to talk about, can be isolating, can feel like stigmatized, and try to bring a spirit of curiosity and swapping stories so that we all feel like we have a little bit more company as we go through these hard things in life that also affect each and every one of us, despite
Yeah.
how alone we can feel.
Yeah. What was the impetus for wanting to have conversations about hard things on a podcast?
I mean, for it kind of has a weird origin story. I covered politics before that, and I found that when I would, go to strip malls and parks and talk to voters about how do you think things are going in the country, the tape that I would often use in stories was about who they were going to vote for, but what they really wanted to tell me was about, some big stuff that was going
Mm-hmm.
on in their lives. And it was affecting whether they felt like things were going in the right direction or the wrong direction. And then I would be interviewing politicians, and there was just a lot of talking about things in this sort of performative way that didn't feel totally authentic. And so it was kind of a reaction to that, like, let's actually talk about this stuff. Like,
Mm-hmm.
let's actually like I wanted to flip it. So rather than getting to know a voter so I could do a story about who they were going to vote for, I wanted to just do a story about a person who was telling me something about their life that was affecting, something big. So that was kind of intellectually the idea. And then in my own personal life, I was in my early 30s. My first marriage ended. I got divorced. I was very sort of in one of those moments where you feel like gravity is suspended, and all of a sudden you just don't know, like that yearn for feeling grounded again and not
Yes.
knowing the next step to take. Um, and I just wanted to talk with people about how they had encountered those moments in life and what they had done next and what was helpful to them. And so it was that combination of kind of feeling like I was interested in people's stories, so I think other
Mm-hmm.
people would want to listen in, and really meaning it personally. And I don't think I appreciated, I mean, this as a podcast host, like the thing that's really special about this medium is you are creating these very intimate clubhouses where you are reaching people in their most kind of solitary time. Maybe it's on a treadmill, maybe it's folding laundry, maybe it's on a walk. But I think the medium itself is really conducive to uh, like digging into stuff that maybe at other times, and you might flip that page in the newspaper because you're, but the podcast is when you're ready to slow down, I
Mm-hmm.
think, and dig in.
Yeah. And maybe looking for connection too.
Oh yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. You described that so well. I think probably everyone that's listening right now, in my audience specifically, would really relate to that suspended gravity
Mm-hmm.
and wanting to feel grounded and not really knowing, not really. I mean, I think my listeners, most of them feel that way because they lost their person. And,
Mm-hmm.
and so, of course, it makes total sense. But it can be a surprise at how ungrounded one can feel
Mm-hmm.
in that.
And I remember feeling kind of surprised by, like, I have this visual of like feeling like a helium balloon that just could
Mm.
not stay and this terror of not knowing, not feeling in control, like I was just subject to the whims of wind. And what, that didn't feel freeing. That felt terrifying for me. So it was like, oh, I need some scaffolding. And the quickest way to create scaffolding I found was like, just somebody tell me they've understand one little piece of what I'm experiencing, so I at least have a relationship to hold on to for just a few minutes even.
Yeah. My visual was what's that commercial? It was like was it a Robitussin commercial, or maybe it was a Dayquil commercial where the person's head is floating off like a balloon. That was how it felt to me. I
Yeah,
was like
it's
I
very
felt like I kept
similar.
trying to grab myself and pull myself back down. It's like, yeah. Yeah.
Oh.
So your podcast is called Death, Sex, and Money.
Mhm.
I find whenever I mean, always we're talking about death because I work with widows specifically, but whenever I talk about sex and money, those are always the most downloaded podcast episodes. So I
Mhm.
can only imagine the combination of all three, right?
Yeah.
Do you have one that has been particularly more insightful or enjoyable or worthwhile to you than another?
I think they're all so interesting. I mean, I like, the sex episodes when it's an episode where we're really getting into something, whether it's like experimenting with different relationship forms or different ways that people have formed relationships, things about paid sex work. That's always very interesting to me because it feels like it's a window into uh, lots of different ways of experiencing intimacy. Um, and money is interesting to me because it's like so much in a black box all the time, even though we're always like dealing with money. Like every 3 hours of our lives, we're doing something financial. And still it's just it's like this energy that is ever present but never discussed. So I think that I'm just magnetized to that. Like any simple question about it can be so illuminating. But I do think the episodes where I've talked with people who've experienced profound loss, those are the ones that I find myself like, it's kind of like they're like handles that I will like reach for, like when something in my life is going on, just to like just to remind me of I don't know, the big structure that we're all doing this within, which is that uh, we're all headed for an end, each of us. Um, we will all, most of us, experience a profound loss of someone before we get there ourselves. And how, like, I am very interested in like, we can talk about it, we can share about it, and also the way that that disconnect between stories around loss and then the physical manifestation of it, and how people who are in, say, the first year of having lost someone very close to them, like it's kind of um unnarratable in a way, like it's because it doesn't um what I like to like really acknowledge with profound grief is we so want to wrap an arc around it as a way of kind of containing it, and that is so impossible. um and I like um I like giving space for that idea that like you might want in one moment be breaking down as you're thinking about the loss of your husband, and then like 30 minutes later you might be so annoyed at like the neighbor who's checking in on you again and wanting to see if you need dinner because you just want to be left alone. Like the mix of like anger and like unappealingness and also profound loss and needing care is, I think, just really rich. And not shared enough because it's
Mm-hmm.
messy.
Yeah. What? So obviously, since you have had a lot of hard conversations with people, why do you think conversations around the messier subjects or the more taboo subjects are so hard for people?
I don't know if it, I mean, I would be interested in what you have experienced as an interviewer. I have found if someone has gone through profound loss, it's not so much that it's so hard for them to talk about. It's hard for everybody to kind of get clear on what the expectations are about how much we're getting into this,
Mm,
or um, managing that feeling of like, oh my God, I don't want to end having shared this with you, having to comfort you in some backwards way,
mm-hmm.
and so I think maybe it's harder for um like the listener to figure out how to listen and tolerate what comes up for them than it is for
Mm,
someone to talk about it.
mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. I kind of find it varies based on, at least it has for me, with where I am in my own, piece around the topic. So, like early in the days when my husband died, it wasn't an easy thing to talk about. And later it became easier, not really because time passed, but because I, you know, was able to think consciously about it and kind of reconcile it for myself. But something like money, even as it related to his death, I felt way more comfortable with his death before I ever felt comfortable talking about money as it
Hmm.
related to his death. Right. So it was like,
Hmm.
it just kind of follows that trajectory for me anyway, of I got to do my own work first and make my own peace with whatever it is. And then it doesn't feel so weird for me to talk about it. And sometimes talking about it is part of making peace with it.
Hmm. Yeah.
But, you know, until I actually investigate whatever it is that's holding me back in that one area, yeah, it's hard to talk about. It's
Hmm.
internal judgment happening.
Yeah. And there's certainly like maybe it's easier to talk with this one person in this one moment in your life, because they get this one piece of it. But then, oh my God, do I have to talk about this at drop off when I'm taking my
Yes.
kid to the first day of school? Like, how do I get out of this weird social encounter? This ought to be pretty surface, but how do I explain? No. Yeah.
The million times people say, "Oh, you're so strong," and you just want to punch them in the
Yeah.
throat.
Throat.
I mean, you know why they say it and you get it. And but also you just like, you get so tired of hearing it. You don't want to hear it anymore. When you don't feel that way, right? When you don't feel
Hmm.
strong, you don't want to be told that you are.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I know you've interviewed a lot of widows.
Hmm.
What have you taken away from those interviews? What have you learned?
I mean, it's so varied. I will there'll be some moments. I'm married now, and one that comes to mind, an interview I interviewed the writer Leslie Grace Streeter, and her husband died suddenly of some kind of cardiac event in the middle of the night.
Mm,
And um when I say like a death episode that like flashes back to me, that's one that I think about, like because sometimes I'll
mm,
look over at my husband and it'll be just this reminder of like, this is not forever. Like
mm-hmm,
this, this is not guaranteed, this moment.
mm-hmm,
And so I think of moments like that. I also think of um, older women I've interviewed where there were complicated marriages,
mm-hmm,
some that ended in divorce, some that were just complicated, not always easy marriages. And that mix of profound loss with also creating a lot of new space that didn't exist before, um, I think is really interesting to hear women talk about.
mm-hmm.
Certainly, like women who came of age maybe before the mid 70s and for whom this is a really new feeling. Uh, I um, I think it's interesting to talk to people at various stages after. I
Mm-hmm.
think often people are telling their widowhood stories, maybe in the first few years when it's,
Mm-hmm.
but I like kind of hearing people talk about just the way it's an alive process, the grief,
Mm-hmm.
and and how 3 years after, there was like in really intense fury at not getting to have a good death, whatever that is, because the husband couldn't tolerate the fact that it was happening. And then,
Mm.
how years after that, that fury has shifted into something else, and the death experience is less of what is top of mind when the
Mm-hmm.
husband comes up in conversation.
Yeah.
So it's just like really varied. But I do I do just love I I love I'm so interested in relationships and intimate companionship.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that people who have known that and then who have lost that, just I'm just interested in the terrain of it.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't think there's a certain set of things that I've learned from widows. It's more like, what's this been like for you? Tell
Mm-hmm.
me what.
Yeah, because it's also different.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's like you said before, we want there to be this arc of, you know, maybe hope in similarity and hope in a process or hope in stages. And and then when you dig into it, you find out that that's not what it's like for most people.
Yeah.
It's kind of all over the place. When my husband died, one of the things that bothered me the most, in retrospect, was that I really felt pretty unprepared for grief. I I didn't really know what I didn't know, and the only thing I knew was the 5 stages. I didn't. I was kind of like I'm going to get the grief A plus. So I'm going to read all the books and do
Mhm.
grief right, because I thought that was a thing. So I'm curious to know like how your views on grief and grieving, maybe mourning, what they might have been in the early days before you really started having lots of conversations about death, and
Mhm.
how that has shifted over time.
Yeah, I mean, the way you say, you were going to do it right by following the curricula. Like I am very much that personality type as well. And I think I brought that spirit generally to every hard thing in life. I was like, I'm going to
Mm,
be a student of, I, from like a very young age,
mm-hmm.
I collected quote books, and I would, oh, this is how you do, oh, this is what life is about, and I had older sisters. So I really did feel like I could be this very careful student
Uh-huh.
of how life unfolded, and you could navigate your way through in
Yeah.
just the right way. Um, and uh, I think maybe that was also part of the origin story of wanting to start the show, of just like, now I've experienced having my life fall apart. Let's
Mm-hmm.
learn how to have your life fall apart and have a year of yes and do it just right, and like the whole thing. Um,
Yeah.
and that's kind of very quickly fell away as I started doing interviews for the show, and I became much more interested in uh, the idea that many people have discovered before I have, that we're not dealing with equations here and algorithms and life hacks to get our way around and through these difficult things.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and the only thing that helps, like that is sure to help, is figuring out how to have a little company while you get through it, like connecting relationally. Um, that can mean that you share a lot with a group of friends. That can mean having a really useful, helpful mental health professional accompanying you. That can mean a profound experience of connection with a spiritual life, but like where it's not just sitting inside of you. And and that uh, part of that relational process, I talk about talking about hard things, but it's also like surrendering to, like, when you're overcome,
Mm-hmm.
and seeing it as this ocean that you're in, where you are subject to these waves that you are not going to control by just the right self-help book. And I've tried,
Mm-hmm.
like
I feel you.
I think I also kind of came to that having when I was divorcing, when my first marriage was ending, I was a big student of marriage books. And
Mm-hmm.
there's this trope that at the time, this was, how many years ago, like 12 years ago, it seemed like every hot marriage book started the introduction with some note about how second marriages failed at a higher rate than first marriages. So it wasn't that you had the wrong partner, it's that you did marriage wrong.
Mm-hmm.
Basically was
Just
the message
basically what
I
you
I
said.
took away from it.
Cool. Thank you.
And I was like, oh, okay. So that is not I don't actually, I think sometimes you are not with the right partner. However, I did take from that this idea of marriage as this living, breathing process, that and
Mm-hmm.
intimacy is this living, breathing process that like is not good or bad. It's this organic thing, this organism that you're building with this other person.
Yeah.
And
It's a
there's
great way
no
to think about it. It's kind of its own entity.
hack.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. I love that. Um, what was occurring to me as you were talking about like the things that we go through, I think for me was that I kind of thought the point was to get through.
Mm-hmm.
And what I have come to realize is that it's really about, for me, being here, right, with whatever it is. Because so Hugo was my second marriage too. First one, I feel like, I don't know, maybe we'll have to compare ages and trajectories, but I feel like the timelines, the positive quotes are kind of like lining up for me as I listen to you talk. But like, I stayed in that marriage way too long. And part of it was for some of the things that you were saying, right? Is that there's a right way to do it. And maybe I'm doing it wrong. I made my bed, need to lay in it, those kinds of things. Finally do get out. And then met Hugo and believed like, okay, this is it, right? This is what I've been looking for the whole time. And finally found it. And then to have it taken away from me. Right. So in that time, then again, it's like still thinking that this part of life is awful and I got to get to the good part.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so for me, the journey has been realizing, oh, actually, where we all are is always where we are. And it's not about skipping it. It's not about wishing it were Friday or wishing, you were at a less terrible place in your grief. Yes, it makes sense why we do that. But how can we actually just be with ourselves where we are in what we're in? Because that is what our life is in that moment, and it's how we relate to it. I think that matters so much more than trying to get somewhere.
Mm-hmm. And it's really like, that's so hard.
It is
It's
hard. It
so
is
hard
so hard.
because if you're not like totally all about your present, it's hard to stay in the present, because
Mm-hmm.
you're like, how do I, so for me, like that idea of there can be a sense of hope in this idea of if I can just create the right
Mm-hmm.
momentum to shift this stuck feeling or
Mm-hmm.
um but I think you're right. It's like, zooming way out, like the people, the deepest friendships in my life are with people who have encountered profound loss, um, and they they what they sort of like constructed after a lot fell down is so, they just have so much to like, there's so much richness that they can
Mm-hmm.
share. um and for some reason, something that keeps coming to mind is like, I love talking to unmarried women who have been partnered about like their closets and like how they think about the prospect of sharing space again,
Oh.
and the sense of like ownership over their own space that has taken hold slowly of
Mm-hmm.
after living alone, like that sense of like, wait, oh, there's like this whole story of like, when will I find the partner again? But like, wait, you're actually asking me, like, am I going to move my stuff out of my space to make room for this person in this closet? Like, and then you're like, it just like flips the whole idea of like, um, like to think about what you would be having to make smaller that you've built in the
Mm,
absence, while you've been on your own. Um, and I like being reminded of that. I think so much of
mm,
our cultural expectations around partnership and companionship, it can create this expectation that or this feeling like you're incomplete or you're in between. Rather than
mm-hmm.
like, look at the way you can spread out all your glorious treasures that you've
Mm-hmm.
collected. You know what I
Yeah.
mean?
Yeah, totally. It's like, it reminds me of Shel Silverstein's The Missing Piece. Like,
Mm-hmm.
for a long time, I remember really buying into that, of thinking that I was looking for other people who were my missing piece. And then at a certain point, at least I didn't realize it until after Hugo died. I think I fully, like, viscerally realized, oh, actually, I'm the one. Like, I am okay. I am the creator of my safety. I am the creator of my peace. Like, I have everything I need. And then the whole idea of relationships completely changed for me, because it became an opportunity to give, instead of
Mm-hmm.
before, as what I saw was just an opportunity to receive,
Mm-hmm.
right? Or something I needed, as opposed to something that could be fun and light.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And do you think, like, as you made that transition, um was it through in relationship with other widows where you started to sort of rethink things, or like, were you contrasting your life to partnered friends of yours where you were like, oh, I am getting to do this in a different way?
Yeah, I think it was probably a combination of things. So, for one, it was seeing people who had lost their person, be it married or not, and then rebounded quickly, because I could tell they were trying to fill what they perceived was a hole, and seeing that not work, right? In many
Mm-hmm.
cases, fail
Mm-hmm.
miserably, right? And also being repelled completely by the idea of being in another relationship for quite a long time, because like the first one didn't work, and then the second one died, and I was like, forget it. Like, I don't even, I remember going out with a coworker, or a former coworker, one time. I thought it was just for dinner. I thought we were just hanging out. And then I realized, oh no, he thinks this is a date.
Oh
I was
no.
rip roaring mad after it was over. Like, mad I was in that situation. I don't want a date. I just want what I had. I can't have it. Like, all the tears, all the things. And so it was just, for me, the furthest thing from my mind for a long time was a new relationship, which then kind of gave me, and then also watching what was happening in different grief groups I was in, and just eventually coming to the conclusion that actually what I really want is just to be at peace with myself, and
Mm.
to come back to me, instead of trying to find something outside of me, and figure that part out. And then it's this weird experience of loneliness where you sometimes feel it but also not,
Mm.
because you you like your own company,
Mm-hmm.
and you don't really feel the need. It feels like a more freeing place to live from,
Mm-hmm.
for sure, because you don't need to go find it. It becomes like something you could have if you wanted it, but not something that I used to feel like was a problem if I didn't have.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. You're reminding me, I interviewed this isn't about losing a partner, but the writer Brandon Taylor, he's a novelist and short story writer. He described his like ideal emotional state as being a little bit lonely, like alone and a
Oh.
little bit lonely. And it's for him, it's because it's this entree into this world of books and words where he feels most at home and in himself. And I love that, because there's like that little hunger for
Mm-hmm.
for stimulation that's outside of yourself, but kind of liking it. You know what
Uh-huh.
I
Kind of
mean?
fuels you just a little bit
Yeah.
something. That's interesting. So, of the three topics that you talk about I mean, I know that's a little more nuanced than just saying, just because your podcast is called Death, Sex, and Money, but what do you find is the most difficult topic for people?
I mean, it certainly depends on like where people are in their lives. I think we lack skillfulness the most in money
Mm-hmm.
conversations. And I
Mm,
think it's like uh, what I've come to sort of notice is that it's very difficult to just start a conversation about how you feel about your financial life, what's your relationship to scarcity or stability,
mm-hmm.
what you hope for yourself and your kids and your family. It's really hard to launch into that conversation where you don't know, you don't have the reference points. They're not clear for who you're speaking with or who your audience is. And in the US, in Western countries, like we don't talk about class and money unless we feel like we're talking within our own,
Yes.
however we think of our own tribe,
Mm-hmm.
so it can be like, I think that's that's what drives a lot of the silence, and then that's what drives a lot of the shame around money, or that's what drives
Mm-hmm.
a lot of the lack of confidence about the parts of your financial life that you can have some agency over. um, and so it's for me, when I'm doing an interview, it's not so much like, tell me, what did you earn last year? What was your taxable income? It's more like, tell me about like your relationship to like your survival instinct, and like how do you think about risk? And like,
Mm,
hearing Lynn Nottage, who's a Pulitzer Prize winning playwright 2 times, describe like she was working an office job for a human rights organization, and she decided she needed to make art, and she decided to cash out her 401k when she was a young woman, and to do that, it's like, I find that useful to hear her share, because when I think about my own financial life, I am so much somebody who wants to make sure I'm following the rules.
mm-hmm.
And so hearing people talk about money as this something you can relate to with sets of values that shift over time and
Mm-hmm.
depend on, that are context specific, like, I think that is very helpful. I think it's really helpful for people to be invited in to think about the cost of housing or the burden of student loan debt in a way where they don't think like, what have I done wrong, that this thing that I'm not supposed to be
Mm,
struggling with, like, why am I struggling with it? And to create conversations that help people recognize, like, no, like, this is a generational thing. If you're a millennial,
mm-hmm.
if you went to college after the financial crisis, higher ed
Mm-hmm.
cost a lot more. And so um, I think there's a real service in trying to have a lot of different sorts of conversations around money.
Mm-hmm.
Um, that said, back to your original question of like, what's the most difficult conversation to have? I would say, like, for me, where I am in my life right now, as a parent of 2 young kids, when I know I have an interview coming up about someone losing a child,
Mm,
those are the interviews that I know like, I can feel it in my body. I'm like dreading it. I like know I need to schedule a long walk afterwards. It's going to take a lot out of me, because just um, witnessing the possibility of
mm-hmm.
what can be lost, um,
Yes.
which is important to do because it happens every day to people. But it is it's such a uh, visceral sense of such a deep fear that
Mm-hmm.
it's difficult for me, and at this point in my life, to like um, talk about.
Yeah. So you told me you go on a walk after. How do you support yourself in the middle of that interview when you're feeling that fear or anticipating that fear?
Um, it's kind of like when I'm doing. an interview, it's different than like being in a conversation with someone who I'm in relationship with. But when I'm doing an interview, so much of my focus is on really wanting to pay attention to making sure I'm understanding all the things they're communicating to me, like what are the words they're choosing, when their answers get clipped, do I need to like signal that we can move to a different topic? We don't have to go deeper into this. Uh, I'm very focused on wanting to make sure I'm understanding what they're trying to say, and also that I'm doing the interview in a way that feels ethical, responsible, and relational. Like really just kind of like something I do is I'll notice back like to the like kind of maybe like what I've had therapists say to me, like when a therapist might notice like if I like exhale before answering, like I'll notice like I noticed you said it this way, or can you tell me more about that? So it's not so hard for me in the moment, because I'm so much of my attention is on exactly what's happening minute by minute, and it's only after where and I've had to learn this, like especially during the pandemic. I can't just like go to the next Zoom about whatever, open enrollment, like with my
Yeah.
company, like I'll be a mess. Like I have to like lay horizontal and breathe and like let what I just witnessed and participated in together with the person I was talking with. I have to let it hit me, you know.
Yeah. So it
Um,
sounds like you're really good in the moment of focusing on the other person and the
mhm.
task at hand, but then you also know yourself well enough to know that you need to create some space afterward for your own processing.
Yeah. And that's not that's like trying to do the things that they tell you to do. Go for a walk, take deep breaths, and like, and it helps, but it's still really heavy work, you know? Um, and it's heavy also, especially when it's a remote encounter, because you can't like, I'm like, what is the aftercare for that person that they've just talked to this podcast interviewer about this? And we went deep and like, are they going to the store now? Do they have to pick up their kids right away? Like what is happening with them? And like, what was their experience of that? Um, so the way I've like learned how to manage it is like, how do I manage, the walk for myself, but then also really trying to be in communication with someone afterwards. So they know it's not just like a parachuting in journalist who's extracting their story and moving on.
Yeah. And then leaving them in a pile
Yeah.
and discarding them. Yeah. I think I'm kind of lucky in that most of the people that I interview when we're talking about, hard conversations typically have been my clients. So I have the benefit of knowing I'm coming into the conversation, having already kind of armed them with some
Mm-hmm.
emotional processing tools,
Mm-hmm.
right? And having had big discussions about really hard things in their life before. So I've never been in that position where I've had to have tough conversations with people who I'm not already in pretty strong relationship with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think in those cases, we're talking about hard conversations, but like it can be so, you can also feel the opposite, which is like the sense of deep connection and power that can come from co-creating a conversation and listening, feeling listened to. Like, so I feel like it's not, that's the part where when I do feel like, ooh, are there icky parts of this work of like making people say hard things and then putting it on
Mm-hmm.
speed, like I do think it is, there's a mission and there's a service to it, which is like the person who you're paying attention to and letting them be the narrator of their story at length, um, can be very empowering experience. And then the service of having for the listener who like needs to feel like they're not the only one.
Yeah. Yeah. If you were trying to like find the silver lining, in every story, and and like find the positive happy outcome. Like it sounds like you in your teenage years were probably would have been inclined to do. Yeah, it would feel probably pretty creepy.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I took a moth style storytelling class before I started the show. And my teacher, Adam Wade, he's a storyteller in New York. It always kind of echoes in my head when I'm doing edits. He would always say, like, don't put a bow on the end. Take off the bow. Just like let the end sit there and land for a listener instead of being like, and thus and so, here are your takeaway, like this is
Yeah.
like because it's like the bow is like, let's make this not have loose ends. And
Mm-hmm.
I really think loose ends are where it's at. Like we're all dragging around some loose ends every
I
day.
love that so much. I think actually that's a huge thing in coaching too, because I think I am a coach, but also I train coaches. And
Mm-hmm.
and especially like master level coaches, I think that is one of the hardest habits to break when you put that kind of pressure on yourself as a coach to tie it all up, to make it pretty, to show them where they've come. Like, and also it's so limiting because you
Mm-hmm.
kind of, I think the loose ends open the door for the next introspective moment that they might have on their own. And if you
Mm-hmm.
kind of tidy it up too much, they miss that.
Mm-hmm.
So it's kind of a weird experience for the coach because I don't know, it just feels creepy. But I get why we do that. If we think, and this is what I used to think, I'm curious about your opinion on this. I used to think when I discovered coaching, kind of the goal was to feel better. I was still in that place where I was kind of buying into the happiness is the goal of life, place. And so, um, as opposed to what I believe now, which is just being human and feeling the feelings is the point of life, and consciously creating what we want, and like that doesn't mean it's all good at all, but because I was coming from a fix it because it's broken mentality, that really showed up in my coaching.
Mm-hmm.
Versus now I feel like, no, we're not, feelings aren't problems to be fixed, they're just experiences to be allowed. Like we don't know why these things are happening to us other than because we're human, but it's not like we have to find the silver lining or be grateful, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's this happened, and then what do I want to make of it? And I'm feeling this way, and now who do I want to be? And none of it is morally superior or somehow better than. It's just choices we get to make along the way, which is
Mm-hmm.
really different than, I feel like I could get my journal and show it to you and you would be like, yeah, I have those same quotes written down from 16, right? Of like the point is to be positive and happy and do it
Yeah.
right. I don't know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I
Yeah.
mean, this idea of like not messing up. And if when you're something I've been thinking about lately is like, if that's your paradigm of like, if I'm managing things well, I'm not messing up, like when you do not know that next step, like the shame, man, like, why can't I figure this out? And shame is heavy.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and shame gets in the way of like experimentation and taking risks. And so that's kind of what uh I'm turning 43 this week. As I
Mm.
turn 43, I'm very like, I'm trying to yeah, come like move away from that idea in a more, have more self-compassion, and that like, if you don't, when you don't know, that's your information right now. And I
Mm-hmm.
saw this quote. This is an Instagram quote. I still like quotes, but this quote was nice. I think it's Anais Nin, and it was like, some years are questions and some years are answers.
Mm.
And I really appreciated that because one of the like when I like the heaviest emotional times in my life have felt like when I feel a heaviness, but I don't know an action that will help it lift. And so
Mm-hmm.
then I feel like I'm not competent, and I feel like, shame. And it's
Mm-hmm. Because
like,
the heaviness is somehow a problem that you've caused.
yeah, or a problem I've caused, or like, even if I haven't caused it, can't I work my way out of this? Can't I do
because
the
it
right
shouldn't be
like
here.
yoga routine or the right whatever? Like, like our culture teaches us that it's just you just need to keep like tweaking your self-care and you're gonna feel all right. And I think like it's so freeing to be like, oh, I'm noticing this is new. This is a new question. Like if I can bring that spirit, like that feels so much sort of like looser,
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. To be able to like be with uncertainty
Mm-hmm.
and like let something show itself to you
Mm-hmm.
as opposed to needing to try to solve it or figure it out. Yeah. I resonate with that too. I think that was what was initially really attractive about life coaching was that it to me had the answers.
Mm-hmm.
It's like the great bait and switch. And you realize,
Yeah.
oh no, actually, you don't need all the answers. You're never going to get them. And how about we just make peace with uncertainty? Surprise. It's been a good transition though. So tell
Yeah.
us about your book.
My book, it's called Let's Talk About Hard Things. And it started as kind of like people would ask me like how do you know how to talk to people about hard things? How do you get people to open up? Because I don't have I'm not a psychologist, I don't have a mental health background. I'm a journalist. Um and I was like, well, what is it that I do? Like, how is it that I create the conditions in an interview to, slow down enough and to make enough room that we go to places that are often unexpected for me and the person that I'm interviewing. And so that's how it started. And then it kind of, as I thought more about the utility of such a book, I also felt really clear that, hard things are not new in life. We have always had difficulties dealing with death, sex, money, or any number of hard things. But I do think that in 21st century America, um, we have less uh, we have less rituals. We have fewer like sort of go-to institutions. We have less sort of like customs to that we follow collectively that accompany us on going through these hard things. And it feels to me like the onus is on each of our shoulders individually to become more skillful at talking about hard things. One example could be, if I meet a mom, who at drop off, who I learn, lost a loved one during COVID, like, what is that thing I'm going to say quickly, as I'm getting to know them, like to let them know I heard them, I understand how their family is built now, and like that it's part of this collective loss we've all been through as a culture. There's that example. Or there's like figuring out, should I refinance my mortgage? And it used to be that we would go to a neighborhood brick and mortar bank and sit down maybe with somebody who we'd known for years and talk to them. And now, I don't know about you, but like I make all my major financial decisions by like Googling and going to various personal finance websites and then entering calculators, and then I hit submit. And it's like, and I have been the only way I've gotten through the gauntlet of early parenthood and childcare costs and, figuring out what to do is like being the one who's brave in a conversation with another parent of young kids and saying like, wait, how do you do this? So it was those two ideas of like the let's like, I wanted it to not be like, I wanted it to feel like an invitation, like, let's talk about hard things. All of us have hard things. It's a series of kind of reported characters that you meet who talk about kind of learning key sentences that have been helpful in dealing with hard things. One in the sex chapter is, what are you into? A sentence that can lead to all sorts of clarity with a potential partner or a long-term partner that you haven't had that conversation with. But also that it's like, there's a real responsibility I think we have to not dodge. And because we're building back some connective tissue that I think has it's pretty, that's been tattered in our
Mm-hmm.
communities, and we can do a little work relationally to build that back by not being as scared to talk about things we don't always know exactly how to start talking
Mm-hmm.
about.
Yeah, and I think the more and more we depend on social media and the more siloed we are in where we get our news, and the more like binary we are in how we think about groups of people and what they believe, the more I like that you use the word responsibility. I probably would have used the word opportunity, but I like responsibility better. Of that is how we find common ground and move forward and connect as humans, right? Is by one at a time having uncomfortable conversations and getting to know where someone's coming from. This isn't really necessarily about grief, but there's just so much value in that, and it really is going to take individual conversations, which to me is, for me personally, is being willing to feel something that my primitive brain doesn't want to feel, right? Being willing to expose myself to rejection, which my brain decides also means I could die, and being willing to let those feelings exist and be open to a conversation that maybe isn't the easy.
Or opening yourself up again to like a different kind of uncertainty. Maybe you think you know all the things that you believe about a certain thing, but you're hearing somebody who might have a life that looks really different to you, like
Yes.
talking about some different way they see it. And can you tolerate that? Can you tolerate like, oh, maybe it's more complicated than how I have slotted it in my brain?
Yeah. It's like you're in my brain. I was literally having this, I was going to say conversation with myself on my walk this morning. Thinking about it was on my brain when I wasn't even preparing for your interview. It was just what I was thinking about. I'm curious because I know we're going to have to wrap up soon, but I'm curious to know because I struggled with it, and a lot of widows that I've worked with struggle with it. But what have you seen, and why do you think we struggle with it so much as it relates to money after your person dies? So they die, you get life insurance or, some sort of payout. And then I call it wealth purgatory, right? Where you have more money than you thought and you think you're going to feel good, but you actually feel terrible. What have you seen in the interviews that you've done with people as it relates to money after a circumstance they didn't want?
Yeah. I mean, it's complicated.
Yeah.
I just talked with, we did an episode about paying for weddings. And one of the people I talked to was a young woman whose mother died suddenly, and she inherited money that she did not know she was going to inherit, including a fund specifically for a wedding. And so she was enabled to have a wedding celebration that was much fancier than she and her partner had ever thought would be possible for them. And there were all sorts of feelings that came up around that, including, oh my gosh, would my mom think I paid too much to the dry cleaner who I had, because she'd bought a used wedding dress that was a good value, but she thought her mother would think that she paid too much to have it dry cleaned. And then there was the social anxiety of, all of our friends and loved ones know what we do for a living, and they know that we could never afford this on our own. And like, how do we acknowledge where this came, how we paid for this, and how do we bring my mother into the room and thank her for the generosity? Or also the fear of, she was afraid, she realized she hadn't budgeted for tips, and so she was over budget for all of the caterers and things. So then she was like, do I put it on my credit card, or do I ask my dad for help, even though he's just lost his wife? And all sorts of like hard, guilty, shamey money stuff come up. And that's like, it's because it's not about money. It's about like our relationship to this memory, and I don't feel secure, and then I have more money than I ever have, and like that doesn't make sense. And like, what is money even for? Like, that's a question that can be updated, and quite like probably needs to be after how you thought your life was going to be. If it's a sudden loss, like, what matters to me?
Yes.
And so I think that like, money is this container, like, oh, this money, I have so many feelings about this money. You have a lot of feelings about the loss of this person. And alongside that, you have this question of like, what do you do with these dollars that are in this account? And it's like staring at you that you haven't made choices or whatever. Or maybe your partner left you with a lot of debts you didn't know about. So I think it's like really hard. And I think the other thing that when I was working on my book that I talked to therapists and mental health professionals about is like, it can also be difficult to find a therapist who's really willing to talk about the emotional dimensions of money. Because as a class, as a group, as a cohort, therapists tend to be kind of money avoidant, like tend to be very service oriented people. So not people who like to think about money being a key value. So like talking about it can feel crass. So you got to find the right person who can dig in there with you about it. Because it's about what I have observed is like making choices about money are real choices you have to make. And the best you can hope for is getting clear on like, what are the feelings around it by kind of trying to unbraid the feelings you have about the money with like what the money as a tool can achieve for you.
Yeah. And sometimes you're being asked to make those decisions at a time when people are telling you don't make big decisions.
Yeah.
Which is also super fun. And feeling like, as you described, gravity has been suspended and we're now floating above the earth. Yeah. All kinds of fun.
And what are you going to do with the house? Yeah.
Oh, right. Yeah. You're so many rules. I wish we had more than an hour. This has been a really great conversation. Thank you for coming on.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Yeah. Was there anything you wanted to talk about that we didn't? So they need to go listen to your podcast, Death, Sex, and Money. Let's Talk About Hard Things is your book.
No, I mean, the one curiosity I have is like, have you found, I'm just curious, in your work, talking to people who've lost their partner or their person, do you find that it's like, are you able to connect? How much are you able to connect like intergenerationally, and how much do you feel that your precise experience, you feel the most kind of like understood when it's somebody who is in a similar life phase? Because I imagine it just feels you have so many different expectations around how long a partnership might last when you're in midlife versus when you're coming to the end.
Yeah, I don't find it difficult to connect so much. And I guess in my mind, I'm kind of just always trying to view the world from kind of a neutral perspective from where I sit, but also simultaneously viewing it as they view it. I think because a lot of what I'm doing is, dealing with pretty intense stuff, some of that is just helping. It's just education, right? It's helping people understand what goes on in the human brain when we're partnered. And why it takes time, but also time isn't the only thing it takes. Because people don't know much about grief, no matter how long they were with their person or how their person died or whatever, because they don't know much about what to expect. What I notice is that the similarities are that they tend to blame themselves. They tend to think there's something wrong with them. They tend to think there's a right way that they should be experiencing it. They expect it to be linear, staged, right? They're never where they should be. Of course, they should always be further along, or, and so it's those things that connect more to me than the circumstances of the loss or the relationship. It's more about, that's why I eventually decided, well, it's been a number of years ago, but in the beginning, I only did one-on-one work with people. And that's what eventually made me decide, no, this needs to be done in community, because most of what I'm coming up against with people as their roadblocks, or that they think that what's going on with them is only happening to them, or that is some sort of character flaw within themselves. And if I can get them in a group and I can normalize what's happening, and they can see it in other women with very different life experiences, right? So I've got a woman coming to the program. I'm so excited. She's 86. I'm so here for it. And then I also have, all the way into, low 30s. But it doesn't really matter how or when or whatever has happened. None of it needs to be weaponized. None of it means we're crazy. None of it means we're doing it wrong, because it's just not possible to do it wrong. Right. It's those things that people can see in each other and then normalize and find comfort in the relationship of, oh, okay, I see myself in her, and maybe this is just really hard and I'm not broken. Maybe this is just what grief is like. And that to me those are easy connections to see.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
It's
look at, well, go ahead.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, look at me trying to ask you a closing question, and then you get me all started again. I'm like, do we have to be done? Like, we could just keep going.
Yeah. That's really interesting. I'm really glad that we connected over video, and I'm excited to dig in more to your work.
Well,
it sounds
same.
like you are providing quite a community for people who need it.
I love what I do on a level that I would have never expected. Truly. Yeah. Well, thank you again so much. Maybe you could come back.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right.
Let's hang again.
Thank you. I would love to do that. Thanks, Anna.
Okay. Bye.
If you like what you've been hearing on this podcast and want to create a future you can truly get excited about even after the loss of your spouse, I invite you to join my Mom Goes On coaching program. It's small group coaching just for widowed moms like you, where I'll help you figure out what's holding you back and give you the tools and support you need so you can move forward with confidence. Please don't settle for a new normal that's less than what you deserve. Go to coachingwithkrista.com and click Work With Me for details and next steps. I can't wait to meet you.